A new police chief walks into his precinct undercover, hoping to observe his officers without their masks on. But when a white cop spits in his face, thinking he's just a nobody, the entire room is moments away from a shocking revelation that will leave them all reeling. It was a sweltering Monday morning in late July, when Richard Nelson, freshly appointed as the new police chief, stepped out of an old sedan in the center of Blue Ridge, a small city hidden among the hills of North Carolina. Wearing a faded plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, he looked nothing like a man who had spent over 20 years moving up the ranks of law enforcement, and that was by design. Richard wanted to see the truth, raw and unfiltered, not the polished version that came with formal welcomes or choreographed meetings. As a black man taking command of a precinct already clouded by rumors of misconduct, he knew walking in blind wasn't an option, so he decided the best way to gauge the culture was to blend in. The lot outside the precinct buzzed with officers exchanging banter, rushing in and out, barely glancing at him. It wasn't surprising. His appointment had been announced less than a week earlier, and he had purposely kept his arrival quiet until the official inspection later that morning. Tugging the brim of his baseball cap lower, Richard inhaled deeply, the weight of responsibility pressing heavy on his chest. He had faced resistance before, but this would be unlike anything he'd encountered. Inside, the fluorescent lights glared against spotless tiles, the stale smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. The hum of phones and chatter filled the space. Officers gathered in small groups over paperwork or gossip, and no one gave him more than a passing glance until he lingered near the break room. "Hey you," a voice barked. Richard turned to see a white officer striding toward him, smirk stretched wide across his face, his badge reading Officer Daniels. Behind him, a few others leaned against the wall, clearly amused before the exchange even started. "Lost are we? This isn't a shelter," Daniels sneered, his tone sharp and loud enough for his buddies to hear. "Take that mess somewhere else." Richard's chest tightened, but he kept his expression steady, debating whether to reveal himself or watch the show play out. Before he could answer, Daniels closed the distance, raising his voice as if performing. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." The laughter that erupted from the others was sharp and cruel, one officer even pounding a table while muttering about keeping the riffraff in line. Richard clenched his jaw, his pulse thundering in his ears, but before he could speak, Daniels leaned in close, eyes full of contempt, and spit directly into Richard's face. The world seemed to freeze as warm saliva slid down his cheek. Richard's breath caught, his mind racing, every instinct screaming to react, but instead he reached slowly into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face with deliberate calm while the laughter echoed around him. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Richard asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniels smirked and shot back, "Only the ones who don't belong here," which sent his buddies into another fit of laughter, but Richard didn't answer. He simply turned and walked down the hallway, leaving them behind as the intercom crackled overhead, summoning all personnel to the briefing room. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with idle chatter, coffee mugs in hand, jokes flying freely, the energy casual and unbothered. Richard slipped in through a side entrance, now carrying a folder stamped with the precinct's official seal, and waited just out of sight as the room filled. At the front, Captain Harris, a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache, called the officers to order. "Settle down, we've got an important introduction this morning." Daniels lounged against the wall, arms crossed, smirk firmly in place, clearly savoring what he thought had been a good start to his day. Harris cleared his throat. "As you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been expecting his replacement, and it's my honor to introduce our new Chief of Police, a man with decades of experience and a strong vision for this department." Richard stepped forward, his measured footsteps echoing across the room. Conversations died instantly, and the smug grin slid off Daniel's face as realization struck. A hush swept over the crowd as Richard laid the folder on the podium, his eyes calmly sweeping across the room, pausing just long enough on Daniels to make the man shift in his seat. Good morning, he said evenly. My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief. The silence was suffocating, the weight of those words crashing down on everyone present. When I arrived this morning, I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department without filters. What I witnessed was unacceptable. Murmurs rippled, but he raised a hand, silencing them. Already, I've seen behavior that undermines the very foundation of what we stand for. Let me make this clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends now. The tension in the room was palpable, Daniels shrinking into himself, his face flushed crimson as sweat beaded along his brow. Richard stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his tone sharp, yet controlled. Respect is not optional. It is the cornerstone of this profession. Without it, we fail each other. And worse, we fail the community we swore to protect. His gaze locked on the group, cutting through the silence like a blade. This morning, some of you laughed at what you thought was a powerless man being put in his place. But understand this, everyone who enters this precinct deserves dignity, badge or not. Not a soul moved, every officer caught in the intensity of his presence. He stepped down from the podium, his stride deliberate as he walked toward the ranks. Change is uncomfortable, he continued, his voice low but laced with authority. But it's happening now. Disrespect, discrimination, or the arrogance I've already seen will not be tolerated. Not today, not ever. If you can't uphold that, you don't belong in this uniform. The air was heavy, every officer's eyes fixed on him, and Richard Nelson made it abundantly clear that the era of looking the other way was over. Officer Daniels, Richard said, stopping just a few feet away, and the man's false bravado collapsed instantly. You, Richard continued, locking eyes with him, represent everything broken in this department. When you spat in my face, you didn't just disrespect me, you disrespected the badge, the oath, and the community we serve. Daniels stammered. Chief, I didn't know. Richard cut him off. That's the problem. You didn't care to know. You never stopped to think because you assumed the man in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption is why this department has lost the trust of the very people it swore to protect. The room was suffocatingly silent, every officer pinned in place. Richard turned to the rest. This wasn't just one man's mistake. It's a culture where arrogance and prejudice are tolerated, even celebrated. That ends today. He moved back to the podium, his tone sharper, his voice rising. I've spent decades fighting for justice, not only in the streets, but within departments that looked the other way. Change is never easy, and it won't happen overnight. But as long as I'm chief, this precinct will be built on integrity, accountability, and respect. He paused, then nodded once toward Captain Harris. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending internal investigation. And for anyone thinking this is just a slap on the wrist, you're mistaken. This is only the beginning. Gasps spread across the room, Daniels flushing crimson as he dropped his eyes to the floor. Richard's expression didn't waver. This isn't about punishment, he said firmly. It's about setting a standard. If you can't rise to it, you don't belong here. But if you're willing to change, to be better, then we'll move forward together. And make no mistake, I will hold every one of you accountable. When the meeting ended, the officers filed out quietly, their usual chatter gone. Daniels stormed out, face twisted with humiliation and rage, while the rest avoided eye contact, caught between guilt and reflection. Alone at the podium, Richard stood tall, then finally exhaled before retreating to his office. He knew this was just the start. Years of bad habits wouldn't disappear overnight, and some would never change at all. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to make friends, he had come to rebuild trust. The phone rang. It was Harris. I just wanted to say you handled that better than most would have. Richard leaned back in his chair. Thanks, Captain. But the real work starts now. I want every complaint, every report on Daniels on my desk tomorrow morning. You'll have it, Harris promised, hesitating before adding. You shook them up today in a good way. Richard hung up, allowing himself one brief moment of satisfaction before turning to the pile of reports awaiting him. In the weeks that followed, the precinct shifted noticeably. The laughter that once followed Daniels now fell silent as his suspension loomed, and whispers replaced the bravado. Richard made a point to walk the halls, greeting officers by name. His steady presence a reminder that leadership had changed. Some responded, others resisted. One afternoon, Officer Reyes, a young recruit, approached him nervously. "Chief," she admitted, "I laughed at things I shouldn't have. I went along because I was scared of being targeted, but I want to do better." Richard looked at her, his voice steady but kind. "That's all I ask. Do better, start today. It starts with you." But not everyone was ready to change. Daniels immediately filed an appeal against his suspension, insisting he'd been treated unfairly. Yet Richard stood firm, refusing to bend on the principle that accountability could never be optional. The internal review revealed a long list of prior complaints against Daniels, ranging from excessive use of force to inappropriate remarks, and the appeal was swiftly denied, sending a clear message that the old habit of sweeping misconduct under the rug was finished. Progress was slow, and Richard knew the work ahead would be grueling. Conversations about implicit bias and community relations were often met with defensiveness or skepticism, but he refused to be discouraged, recognizing that every small victory, a rookie speaking up, a veteran officer reconsidering their words or actions, was proof that the tide could shift. One morning at a neighborhood event, a young boy tugged at his sleeve and asked shyly, "Are you really the chief?" Richard knelt down with a smile. "I am." The boy's voice dropped fragile. "My dad says the police don't care about us." Richard felt the weight of it, but answered gently, "I can't change what's already happened, but I promise you we're working to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me, all right." The boy nodded, breaking into a hesitant smile. And in that moment, Richard was reminded why he had taken on the fight. By the close of his first year, the precinct was far from flawless, but it was undeniably transformed. Those unwilling to adapt had moved on, replaced by recruits who embraced his vision of fairness and respect. The community, once distrustful, began to notice real change, bridges slowly being rebuilt, trust inching back where it had been shattered. One evening, Richard stood in the main hallway, watching officers finish their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie sounded different now, genuine and inclusive, not sharpened at someone else's expense. He knew challenges would never disappear, but for the first time since arriving in Blue Ridge, he felt true hope. Change was never simple, but it was worth every battle.